In this video, we're going to be going over biological diversity and survival. Throughout this video, we're going to be covering the following topics. We will first look at what is biological diversity. Second, we're going to be looking at why biological diversity is important. Third, we're going to be looking at three different types of biological diversity, which are ecosystem diversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity. Fourth, we're going to be looking at the variation between species and the species diversity. Fifth, we're going to be looking at variation for survival. And sixth, we're going to be looking at how to measure biological diversity. And seventh, we're going to be making a Python program showcasing the amount of species in 4 different national parks. So let's get started with what biological diversity is. So biological diversity is also called biodiversity. And biodiversity is the name to all of the varieties of life of organisms on Earth. This includes from fish to birds, from plants to people. They all live in ecosystems, and these ecosystems can be bodies of water, forests, cities, and deserts. And if you put the number of varieties of organisms all together, this is what we call biodiversity. So to further expand what biodiversity is, biodiversity can also be used to describe a range of habitats, from small local habitats to the entire Earth. A low biodiversity might not be a concern. For example, the Arctic or some deserts have very low biodiversity, but there are still species living there, and there still is living organisms at those places. But if you do have a decrease in diversity, that is a concern, and it's mostly caused by human activity. So now that we know a little bit of what biodiversity is, let's look at why it's important. So here are some examples of why it is important. So sometimes jungles can become into deserts. Some coral reefs from the bottom of the ocean can become lifeless rocks. So what makes one ecosystem strong and another weak? The answer to this is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of 3 intertwined features, and these 3 features are ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. So the more intertwining there is between these features, the more resilient an ecosystem becomes. Imagine a world without mosquitoes. What would happen to the food web if there was no more mosquitoes? So biodiversity is important for the survival and health of ecosystems and communities. So as I just said before, we're going to now cover the 3 different intertwined connections for biodiversity, and those are species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So let's start off with ecosystem diversity. So ecosystem diversity deals with the variation in ecosystems within a geographical location. Ecosystem diversity addresses the combined characteristics of biotic properties and abiotic properties. And if you didn't know, biotic means living and abiotic means non-living. And some examples of ecosystems could be deserts, forests, cities, marine ecosystems, rainforests, and so on. So now let's talk about genetic diversity. So genetic diversity is basically the variety of genes among one species. So for example, humans. Some humans are really tall, some humans are really short. Some people have really big hands, some others don't. So those are basically all different genes among the same individual species. And genetic diversity serves as a way for populations to adapt to changing environments. So now let's talk about species diversity. So the species diversity is basically the number of different species and individuals within each species in a community. So here's a famous example of Darwin. He counted about 13 different species of finch from 2 different islands. And some of the birds had really long beaks, some of them had really short beaks, some of them had medium-sized beaks. So even though they're all birds, they're part of one species, they all have individual different types of features. So now that we know what makes up biological diversity, now let's look at variations within species. So organisms within the same family can still be a variation of species. In general, organisms of the same species are similar in appearance. For example, dandelions. To us, all dandelions look the same, but if you look closely, there are millions of different species of dandelions. And some organisms have many different species. So how did so many species come? So many different organisms also have different species. For example, cats. So if you say the word cat, you can mean a cat in your home that you have as a pet. You can mean a tiger or a lion or a cougar or a bobcat or a lynx. There are many different types of cats, and cats is just a big general word, but there's hundreds of different types of them that you can find. So how did so many different types of these species come to be? So over time, one species evolves and then they separate. This process is called speciation. Much of Earth's biological diversity is due to this separation. So now let's talk about variations for survival. So every single different organism has its own adaptations to survive. So to live, there are many different problems that occur to live. So for example, you need to find a shelter and you need food. So there are two different things that helps an organism survive. One of them is structural adaptations, which is physical structures such as like our teeth or your mouth or your eyes or your beak or something like that. And then there are also behavioral adaptations, and that usually depends on the organisms. For example, some owls hunt at night, and some animals might have night vision powers. Some might have a really good sense of smell, some might have a really good sense of hearing, and so on. So those are two adaptations that most organisms have to survive. So now let's talk about how to measure biodiversity. So usually you measure biodiversity using an index of diversity. And the formula of the diversity index is basically the number of species, also called as runs, divided by the total amount of organisms. And I'll put an image up and also use the diversity index to solve the biodiversity in the place. And the closer the diversity index is to 1, the healthier the environment is in that area. And the closer the diversity index is to 2, the less likely it is that the environment will stay healthy in the long term. So that's basically how scientists and biologists help to measure diversity. So now I'll be moving on to the coding part of this video. I already have all the code over here, and I'll put the link in the description for where I got this code from. Basically, one person on GitHub made a code analyzing the amount of species of animals in 4 different national parks in the United States. They gathered all the information and put them in a text file. You can download their code from their GitHub page. But anyways, this is what we're going to be coding today. So just before we start, you're going to need to have the following libraries installed in order to do this program. You're going to need NumPy, Seaborn, Pandas, and Matplotlib. I already made a tutorial on how to download these files, so you can go ahead and watch that video, or you can watch tutorials on YouTube on how to do that. And also make sure that every file downloaded from their GitHub page is in the same place as where your Python file is. It should look like this, for example. It should have all of their code here and their images inside of the same place as your main.py. So that's just an example of how it should look like. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the coding part now. So I'm just going to do a quick run to show you guys how it looked like as a result. So once this runs, we're basically just going to be doing this. So if you look inside of the species underscore info, the text file, you can see all of the data that he's collected. You can see all of their data here. So basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to take all this data from here and we're just going to plot them on this chart here. So inside of his text file, you can see that there are 4,262 vascular plants and 488 birds and so on here. So that's just basically what we're going to be making today. So let's start on with the code here. So since I already have all the code over here, I'm just going to explain what each line does. So first we're going to be importing pandas as PD. So here we're just going to be importing our libraries, and then next we're going to be importing Seaborn as SNS, and then we're going to be importing matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. So these are just going to help us with our code later on over here. And you can also add import NumPy as well. That also might help, but it's not necessary for this code. If you do copy all of his code from their GitHub page, then you will need that NumPy, but just for this we won't need it. Okay, so here making this variable called this name, and then we're going to be basically just reading this file here, which is observations.csv, and you can see that that file is in here as well. So we're basically just going to be reading that and putting that inside of this variable here, and then we're doing the same thing with info_df. And then we have our species info.csv, and we also have that file right here, so we're just going to be reading those two there. And here we're just going to be writing our species_fix, and then we're just going to be putting the info from this inside of here, and then we're using species_fill NA, and then we're just going to be putting that into here as well. Next, here we're going to be creating a function, and this is just going to help us to actually plot our grid and everything. So first we're going to be styling our grid at the back. So we're going to have the lines in the background. If I pop the grid up right now, I'll show you what that one does. So let's just wait for that to open. Yeah, so this grayish color here, we're going to be having, this is going to help us to get that. Then here we got our SNS.setContext and then talk. So that's basically just going to help us to bold all of this text here, all the numbers and all of the text there. And then here we have our values. We're just going to be placing our values here. So if we go back here, basically just these values, we're just going to be placing those. And then here, this is all of this for loop here is going to help us to generate the number above the bar. So if you see, we have the numbers above the bar. So we have 4,262, 488. So this for loop helps us to plot all those numbers. And then here we're just plotting our title. We're plotting the X label and we're plotting the Y label. And then we're just showing our grid, and then we're calling our function to make it run. So that's just basically all the code we have here. So now let's just run it to see what we will get. So waiting for it to run, and yeah, that's basically what we get. We have our count on the side, we have our category of the animals, we have the total count of unique species, we have our grid here, and we have the numbers on the side and the species names on the bottom. So we have vascular plant 4,262, bird 488, non-vascular plant 333, mammal 177, fish 126, amphibian 79, and reptile 78. So that's basically it for the coding part and for this video. If you guys ended up enjoying this video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe because it does take some time to make these videos. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.